Okay, so I drew all this up here to get started so I could just sort of talk you through it. So it looks like a bunch of stuff. Just ignore all this for now and just think about what we know about profit maximization, perfect competition. We know these graphs. So you have the market here and a representative firm here. The market determines the price. The firm takes the market price as given and it produces, so it follows that out till price hits marginal cost. And it produces the profit maximizing level of output. There are three things that can be true in the short run. Price can be greater than average cost, as we saw, and a firm would be making a profit. Price could be below average cost. And again, when we say price is above or price is below, we mean at Q-star. The first thing you do is always find where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. You find that profit maximizing level of output. And you say, at that level of output, price could be above marginal cost and I'm making a positive profit. Price could be below marginal cost and I'd be making a loss, or price could be exactly equal to average cost, in which case profit would be equal to zero. Any of those situations can happen in the short run. In the long run, only one of these is a stable equilibrium. And that's because of that characteristic of perfect competition that says there's free entry and exit. There are no barriers to entry. So if profit is greater than zero, the firms in the industry are happy. They're like, yay, this is great. I'm making a positive economic profit. My resources are earning more here than they could anywhere else. I have no incentive to change my behavior, says the firms in the industry. The firms outside of the industry who have their resources in places that are earning less than they could here, if your resources are earning more than they could elsewhere, those people who are elsewhere are saying, I want in that industry. I want to jump in there because there's positive profits. So positive economic profit induces entry. So it's not stable. Firms outside the industry have incentive to change their behavior. Negative economic profit, conversely, induces exit. If your price is less than your average cost, you may or may not produce in the short run. We know that because we talked about that in the shutdown rule. But in the long run, if price is less than average cost, you don't want to stay in that business. You're going to take your resources and move them to somewhere where they're more valuable. So it is only when price is exactly, whoops, I said that in the wrong place, didn't I? Exit. It's only when price is exactly equal to average cost that profit is equal to zero that would be stable in the long run. No incentive for entry or exit. And we know when we say equilibrium in economics, we mean a stable situation, right? Where no one has an incentive to change their behavior. So it's only when price is exactly equal to average cost, when your resources are earning here exactly what they could in their next best use. Nobody wants to come in because they're not going to do any better here, but nobody wants to leave because they're not going to do any better anywhere else. Again, zero economic profit doesn't mean you're not making any money. It means you're generating exactly what you could in your next best use. So there is no incentive to leave, but there's no incentive for anyone else to come in. That is a stable situation. So it's only when this condition is met that we're in long run equilibrium and perfect competition. So now I'll go to over here, the conditions for long run equilibrium. One, we already knew this. The firm has to be producing where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. If they're not, then they're not maximizing the profit and they want to be somewhere else. It's not a long run equilibrium if the firm's not producing at the profit maximizing level because they have an incentive to change their behavior and get here. So that has to be true. It also has to be true, as we just described here, that price is equal to average cost at Q-star, that firms are earning zero profit. Otherwise, there would be incentive for entry or exit. It would not be stable. So if both these things have to hold for it to be stable for nobody inside or outside of the market to want to change their behavior. And if you take both these conditions together, remember that marginal revenue and price are the same thing in perfect competition. So if marginal revenue, price equals marginal cost, and price equals average cost, if price equals marginal cost and price equals average cost, the marginal cost has to equal average cost. And we know from earlier that marginal cost intersects average cost at minimum average cost. So we know, given these other two conditions, given that these conditions hold, we know that firms are going to be producing at minimum average cost. And that should kind of make sense, right? Because we're in a perfectly competitive industry. Firms can jump in at will. So if I'm making a profit, other firms are going to jump in and they're going to push the price down. If they can produce more cheaply, so let's say price is $10 and they can lower their price to their cost to $8, they'll do that. But then price will drop down to $8 and then I'll be losing money. So this competition, this free entry really forces everyone to produce as efficiently as possible, because if you don't, you're going to be making negative economic profit. And so that's one of the perfect thing. What's so perfect about perfect competition? We talked a lot about it being allocatively efficient. And it's also, this is an illustration of why it's productively efficient. You leave the market alone and it gets you to production at minimum average cost as cheaply as the output could be made. Firms are driven to produce there because if they don't, they'll be making negative economic profit. So that's the long run equilibrium. And the thing is, if you leave a market alone, it will find its way to this equilibrium. If something happens, it will readjust, it will re-equilibrate, as we say, and it will get back to a new long run equilibrium. If something happens, remember back when we first learned about supply and demand, those good olden days, when it seemed like it was kind of complicated, and now just supply and demand seems pretty simple, right? So remember we say, oh, incomes increase, so demand shift out, or cost of production increase, so supply decreases. If something like that happens, if some exogenous shock, as we like to say in our lingo, if something happens to shift supply or something happens to shift demand, we know we've seen the market re-equilibrate here. But in the long run, when firms have a chance to enter or exit the market will eventually find its way back to a stable long run equilibrium on its own. So let's see how that happens. I'm going to erase all of these words. And since we're in the long run, I put the average variable cost curve up there just because you might say, oh, aren't we supposed to always have the average variable cost? But since we're talking about the long run, we don't even need to make the distinction between variable and fixed costs, because there are no fixed costs in the long run. All of our costs are variable, right? We have a choice over everything. So let's just get rid of that cost now that we're just talking about long run. So this is what long run equilibrium looks like. Producing more marginal revenue equals marginal cost, and at that level of output, price is exactly equal to average cost, and we're right there at minimum average cost. So let's see, let's say demand increases. So we're in a stable long run equilibrium, and then demand increases to D1. Now we've learned this when we first learned this about supply and demand. An increase in demand drives up market price. I'm going to put a little zero. Drives up market price. So over here, so increase in demand increases price. And that increase in price, you can see firms are price takers. So now they're taking P1 as a given. That's their new marginal revenue. And so they were producing Q star. Make that all red. They were maximizing their profit here at Q star 0. Now price has gone up. And so some units that weren't worth it to make are now worth it to make. So the firms are price takers, the price is higher, they move up their marginal cost curve, and all the little firms produce more. So price increases, the output, little Q star, the firm's output increases, and big Q star, the total output in the market, is going to increase also, because the Q star in the market, remember the market supply just comes from all the individual firm supply curve. The market supply is just the sum of all the little firms' output. So let's say this is 100, because that's easy. And let's say and the number of firms equal 50. So the number of firms, I'm just going to say N on your notes. The number of firms initially is 50. And so total output in the market is 50 firms, each making 100 units of output, or 5,000 units of output. I just want to make that connection really explicitly clear. The total market output is just the sum of all the individual outputs in the market. So if there's 50 firms and they're each producing 100 units of output, total output in the market is 5,000. So when all the little firms start producing more, let's say now they're producing 150, then we're going to have what? The new market output, there's going to be 50 firms, each making 150, or we're going to have 7,500 units of output. So I just really wanted to make clear the connection between those two graphs, between what's going on in the individual firms, but the market is made up of all these individual firms behaving this way. So price goes up, all the little firms produce more, and so total output in the market is higher. And that's what happens in the short run. So demand increases. This is what happens in the short run. So that's what we're sort of used to seeing. Demand increases, price goes up, output goes up. We're used to seeing that graph. So let's say income increased in this market. Demand increased, we're at a new higher price, a new higher quantity. What's going on? This is what's been going on in the background. All the times we've been using this graph, this is what's going on in the background. Demand goes up, price goes up, more is produced because all those little firms move up their marginal cost curve to a higher quantity. And there we are. And that's the short run. And the firms would be happy to stay there because the other thing that's going on, you can see at Q star, there's their average cost. They're making a positive economic profit. Price is greater than average cost at Q star. So the difference between price and average cost out over all those units. Profit increases, it's now greater than zero. The firm would be happy to stay there. They're making a positive economic profit. They're making more than they could in the next best use. The problem, though, is that there's those pesky firms outside the industry, right? I'm happy here, but there's firms outside the industry that say, oh, I'm earning more there than I could in my next best use, and so I want to enter. So the profit greater than, oops, let me make that a clear grid. Profit greater than zero induces entry. And when firms enter, that's going to lead to an increase in supply, because supply is just the sum of all the individual marginal cost curves. One firm changing their behavior isn't going to change market supply, but if a bunch of firms start to enter because they see these profits and they want to be in the market, a bunch of firms start to enter, you're adding in more and more and more and more marginal cost curves. They all look like this, and you're just adding more and more of them. The amount that's being produced at every price is going to get bigger. And so we're on this. So P increased to P1, Q increased to Q1, big Q increased to Q1. And now the supply increase, we're on the demand curve, the green demand curve. So we were here. And now supply is increasing. So we're shifting out. We know an increase in supply is going to lead to a decrease in price. Supply shifting out, price starts falling. I'm not going to draw the supply curve yet, but you can see as supply shifts out along that green curve, price is dropping, price is dropping, price is dropping. As price is dropping, all the individual firms start moving back down their marginal cost curve. Those units from 1 to 150 that were worth it to produce are not worth it anymore. As price keeps dropping, there's fewer and fewer units that are worth it to produce. This is going to keep happening entry continues. So supply keeps increasing, price keeps falling. until price equals minimum average cost. And there's no more incentive for entry. So firms will keep entering, supply will keep increasing until price gets driven right back down to minimum average cost to profit equals 0. So firms enter, supply increases until price gets driven back down. So we'll say P2 is the same as P1 because minimum average cost is in the same place it used to be. So price gets driven back down. All the little firms are back to producing where they were. Price is back to what it was. But total output in the market is even bigger because all the firms may be producing 1,000, but now N1 is something bigger. Let's say it's 100 firms. So they're each producing 100 units of output. There's 100. Let me call it 120 firms because otherwise it looks weird that it's 100 times 100. So every firm's producing 100 units of output. There's 120 firms. And so now it's 12,000 units of output. So each firm returns to where they started from, but total output in the market is bigger. It looks pretty messy when you just, if you just stepped up and looked at this, you'd be like, I don't even get what's going on. That's a lot of drawing. But if you work through it step by step and think about what's happening and why, it should make conceptual sense to you. Let's just step back for a second. We're in equilibrium, it's stable. Something happens, preferences change, incomes go up. For some reason, people want to buy more at every price. Demand goes up. That drives up price. At the higher price, all the firms produce more, which means market quantity is higher. Because the price is higher, price is now greater than average cost, profits are positive. Yay. Then firms outside the market see those positive profits and say, I want a bit of the action. I want to be there. I want to move my resources here where they'll earn more. So firms see positive profit. They enter the market. As they enter, supply increases, driving price down. People are going to keep entering as long as profit is still positive. So people are going to keep entering, driving price down until that profit gets driven right back down to 0. And so the firms are right back where they started from because they're facing the same price. So if their cost curves haven't changed, they're going to be right at the same output. So all the individual firms are producing more, but the total output in the market is bigger because the number of firms is bigger. So the market was at P0, Q0. Now it's back to P0. Oops, I should call that Q2, sorry. Back to P0. So the market responds, we're in long run equilibrium. Suddenly people want more and the market responds by making more. And then in the long run, that profit is an inducement for even more firms to come in the industry. It's a perfectly competitive industry. There are no barriers to entry. And so firms will enter. So eventually the market will find its way back to a new equilibrium where the price is the same, but more is being made. The supply, as we would say, is in the long run is perfectly elastic. We were producing Q0 at this price, and now we're producing more at this price. People want more. Eventually we'll get to a place where more is being made, but price is going to be the same. Because if the average cost is the same, if the cost of producing are the same, competition is going to drive price back down to average cost. There will just be more firms producing. And you could work through exactly the same thing in the opposite direction. I'm not going to draw it, but if demand decreased, price would, let's say it this way, if demand decreased, price would fall. So each little firm would produce less, which would decrease market output, and profit would fall, and profit would be less than 0. Price would fall, price would fall, price would be less than average cost, profit would be less than 0. Profit less than 0 would induce exit. As people left, as supply decreased, price would start increasing. Exit would continue until price equaled minimum average. That the punchline is the same. Either there's a profit and firms will enter, there's a loss and firms will exit. Entry or exit's going to keep happening until this part of the story is exactly the same, until price hits minimum average cost and the profits are zero, until there's no more incentive for entry or exit. The market will always find its way to the point where profit is zero. If profit is positive or negative, it's not a stable long run equilibrium. Entry or exit will happen until we get to the point where price is exactly equal to average cost. And because we know when price is equal to marginal cost and price is equal to average cost, then marginal cost must be equal to average cost. And so we're driven to be at minimum average cost and long run equilibrium. But if you leave the market alone and there's an external shock, it will find its way back to that zero profit long run equilibrium, where it's producing the allocatively efficient level of output, all units that are worth more than the cost to make are made, and the productively efficient level of output. We're getting our output at lowest average cost.